everyone. Thank you for joining us today at this session of the Peace in Kurdistan Social Ecology Network. The session is entitled Grassroots Movements in India Today and Ecological Alternatives. We have a couple of speakers from the region. First, I'll just briefly introduce the network and Peace in Kurdistan. Peace in Kurdistan is an organization that was founded in 1994, co-founded by Estella Schmidt. We have our co-founder here. And its aim is to work together with the Kurdish freedom movement in order to promote the ideas of self-determination and democratic confederalism around the world, and to work for a peaceful resolution of the Kurdish question. We have this social ecology network focused on ecological issues throughout the world, each session featuring grassroots movements from different areas around the world in order to provide a platform to have discussions between movements and to find common ground upon which to link, for there's nothing more common than ecology. It is the ground itself, the earth. So we're very happy to have this session and these speakers. This session will be moderated and shared by Felix Padel, who is an anthropologist and writer and public intellectual in India, though originally from Britain. He is well known for his work highlighting Adivasi movements, or indigenous peoples in India, especially against imposed industrialization by aluminium, steel, and dam projects in Odisha. He has also long been associated with Kurdish issues, and he is a patron of peace in Kurdistan. So thank you very much, Felix, and I'll turn it over to you now.
So this meeting has been a long time in planning, and I'm really delighted that Ashish Kothari is here from Pune in the west of India, and he's an extremely well-known public intellectual in India. And Hemant Dalpati from Odisha is an Adivasi. You can later introduce yourself more, but I know you're a school teacher and you're also teaching at a teacher training college. You're also a poet and writer, and you've been linked with many of the Adivasi movements. And I particularly know about the Mali Parbat movement, the anti-bauxite mining movement in South Africa, of course. So I thought I'd just say a few words about movements in India generally, because it's a vast, vast, vast topic. And people outside India in recent years will know about the Citizenship Act movement, especially in 2019 to 20, that was in a way stopped when the pandemic started and many of its participants jailed. That was more on Muslim issues, you could say, on general citizenship issues. And there were very strong movement in Delhi centers, I suppose. And the farmers movement also was actually centered around Delhi, and especially by the Punjabi farmers. And that too everybody around the world knows about that movement. But of course, all around the country, there are just a wealth of movements. And the ones I've worked in particularly are from Hemant's area of Odisha, and the other, what are seen as the largely tribal states of Chhattisgarh and West Bengal and Jharkhand. And there, because these states are very, very rich in minerals. So the steel industry is there, coal mining industry is there, supported since the 1950s by the World Bank. The aluminium industry, which is what I've worked on, its epicenter is in Odisha. So the kind of devastation of landscapes and the imposition of these projects has been something hard to get your mind around. And of course, people from outside India have no idea this is going on often. And what's very painful is these protest movements against the takeover of resources has been superimposed over a Maoist struggle, or the Maoist struggle. The two have come together. So it's a very complex issue, that how many protesters are then labeled and jailed under false cases of Maoists. We can talk about that later, but I won't go into it more now. I also wanted to, I don't think they're here, but very close friends of mine and of Hemant's are Rajaram Sundaresan and Chanya Naik, and they have been supporting especially this Mali Parbat mining movement, where a company called Hindalco, part of the Birla Group, has been trying to mine one of the biggest mountains in South Orissa, and many, many Adivasis and people jailed. Um, I think I won't speak more now. I would love to hear from you, maybe for 10, 15 minutes, Hemant, and then from Ashish. So, do you want to unmute yourself and introduce yourself, Hemant, and just speak what you would like about the schooling issues we have often discussed, and about the mining issues, about whatever you would like to speak about movement in everything. You have to unmute first. Up muted है. नहीं अभी आप muted हैं. Thank you.
Comrades and friends, Jai Bhim and Salam to all. I am very happy and I am grateful that a social ecology network has invited me to speak on this occasion. Actually, I have been told to introduce myself. I'm Hemant Dalpati. I am a teacher educator, and above all, I'm a poet. I'm with the people, those who are struggling against the Brahminical and capitalist force of India. I used to with them and I write about them. So it's my small identity actually. While we are talking about, uh, can I, मेरा सुना जा रहा है ना? Felix, clear हो?
Ashish, I can
I'm clear.
you are better translating him if you like. If you prefer to speak in Hindi or Oriya.
अच्छा अच्छा अच्छा
हेमंत आप हिंदी में बात करना चाहेंगे तो आई कैन ट्रांसलेट
हाँ 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 वो अच्छा रहेगा एक्चुअली इंग्लिश में कंफर्टेबल नहीं थोड़ा टाइम लगेगा एक्चुअली
नहीं ठीक है
देखते हैं
आप
इंग्लिश में
आप प्लीज कंटिन्यू आप इंग्लिश में अगर कंफर्टेबल मतलब कर सकते हैं तो ठीक है टाइम बच जाएगा अगर बीच बीच में हिंदी में बोलना चाहो तो बता दीजिएगा आई कैन ट्रांसलेट
Okay. So we are here to talk about the grassroots movement of India today and its ecological alternative. And if when we talk about the different problems, I must quote Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar here that the root cause of every problems of India is Brahminism and capitalism. And while defining history, Baba Sahib also told that the history of India is nothing but the struggle between Brahminism and Buddhism. So the people of India for a long time has been enslaved by अच्छा मैं हिंदी में बोल देता हूँ उत्तरी जी आप बताइए तो बहुत दिनों से भारत के जो लोग हैं जो मूल निवासी हैं यहाँ के जो आर्यन कहें या ब्राह्मणिक कहें या ऐसा एक रेस के मतलब गुलाम होके
India, the
रहे हैं
Adivasis,
जिसके
the
बाद
indigenous peoples have been enslaved
मतलब
by
कि जाति प्रथा
forms of racism, in
और
particular in
मतलब
India,
कि
the
उनको
peculiar institution of caste, so
हर एक
casteism,
कोड ऑफ
and
कंडक्ट लागू करके
Brahmanis
उनको
sort of views
मनुष्य की
and
तरह
ways of
बहुत
thinking
दिनों
of
तक
the society
मतलब
and
उनको
the
गुलाम बनाया
economy.
और आज भी जो यहाँ का हालत है वो वही गुलामी का एक एक्सटेंशन हिसाब से हम लोग देख सकते हैं और यहाँ का जो आदिवासी लोग मतलब
Yes, so he then says that the this kind of history of enslavement of the Adivasi, the indigenous peoples, continues even now. It is part of the current situation. That history is still continuing. We have about 700 different kinds of Adivasi or tribal or indigenous groups. And they have been in the past part of the anti colonial struggles when the British Empire was ruling India. And then post-independence, and he added a footnote there saying that for the Adivasis in India, it is not really independence, it is a transfer of power from one colonizing agent to another colonizing agent. But post the so-called independence, also these struggles have continued.
ये इसके बाद भी ये मतलब ये ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन ऑफ पावर के बाद भी जितने भी
He added then that
परियोजना आए
post
उसमें ज्यादातर
1947
आदिवासी लोग विस्थापन
so-called
थे
independence,
और
we a whole
फिर
spate of
जब ये
so-called
न्यू
development projects were
इकोनॉमिक पॉलिसी
imposed
लागू हुआ
in
भारत में
India, and many of
जिसको
them
हम
in Adivasi areas, which caused a
लिबरेशन
lot of
ग्लोबल
displacement.
लिबरेशन
Um,
एंड
I just want to add quickly from my side, Himantaji, that the figure of
उसके
displacement in
बाद
India is something like 60
जो
million. That is 60
कॉर्पोरेट
million
का
people
बाढ़ आया
uprooted
हमारे देश में
from their houses and
तो
their
उससे बहुत
Well, of
सारा
that 60 million,
विस्थापन
at least a third, 20
मतलब
million, 25
आदिवासियों
million
पर
are
हुआ
Adivasis. And he also, Hemant also mentioned the new economic policy of 1991, which brought in, allowed lots more multinational corporations to come in. And the aggression since that time has been much more.
तो इसमें जो इंडियन स्टेट का जो रोल था वो इंडियन स्टेट का जो रोल था वो पूरा अपनी जो मशीनरी
So
है
just
जैसे कि
finishing on the
लेजिस्लेटिव
displacement thing, also he added that after
जो भी
1991, when
मीडिया
India brought in
पार्लियामेंट्री
the
फोर्स
economic
ये
liberalization
सब
policies, the globalization policies,
वो
this
मतलब उस
corporatization of
एफर्ट
the
को
economy
जो कि
and
आदिवासी
the
को विस्थापित
displacement of
करते थे
Adivasi peoples
वही
and others has also significantly
वही जो पॉलिसी
increased.
जो
And I think
आदिवासी
what is
को
adding recently
अपनी
also is that there has
बेनिफिशियल
been a
जाता
significant
था और
militarization, a lot
आदिवासियों
of
का जो जल
police
जंगल
in
जमीन
different parts
का
of
अपना
India
पूरी
where
संसाधन
the
को दोहन
corporations
करता
want
था
to take land and forests
वो
and
इंडियन
where
स्टेट
displacement
वो
is taking
पूरा
place,
कारपेंटर
and
बन
especially
गया
also where
उसको
there is resistance
इंडियन
by the
स्टेट में
local
आगे बढ़ाया
communities.
जैसे जैसे कि आदिवासी का स्वभाव ही प्रतिरोधी है और अपनी जल जंगल जमीन को अपना देश अपनी मातृभूमि समझते हैं उसको बचाने के लिए उनका एक जबरदस्त हिस्ट्री है तो ये जो ग्लोबलाइजेशन के तहत इतना सारा इंडस्ट्रियलाइजेशन हुआ इतना मतलब उसको ऐसे
Yeah, so
जाने
he
नहीं दिया
added that
आदिवासी लोग उसको
Adivasis have
जबरदस्त
a
तरीके
very
से
basic,
प्रतिरोध किया
it's in their
और
character
बहुत
to
जगह
resist and
उड़ीसा में
basically to
खासकर बहुत
stress
जगह
their
बड़ा-बड़ा
freedom.
आंदोलन हुआ
And so these resistance
उसमें
movements
से
and with the Jal
जो
Jangal Zameen, which means forest, water,
इंडिपेंडेंस
and land,
इंडिपेंडेंस के आसपास जो
movements to protect
हमारे
forest, water, and land and their
प्लेन के भी
territories
कुछ
have also
जो
been there ever
महानदी
since
नदी
for
बन रही
many
हैं
centuries now, many
तो
decades.
उसके विरुद्ध बड़ा
There have been a lot
आंदोलन
of
हुआ
movements in
उसके
the last
बाद
few decades, especially
अभी
in
जो
the state he
न्यू
comes from, that is in
इकोनॉमिक
Odisha,
पॉलिसी
in
के बाद जो
southern
एलपीजी के
eastern India,
बाद तो इधर
including, for instance, against a very
काशीपुर
big
कलिंगनगर
mega
और
hydroelectricity and irrigation project
बहुत
called
सी जगह पे
Mahanadi, which was
दिग्दम
soon
के
after
विरुद्ध
independence, and then
सैंक्चुरी
many
ग्रुप
of the mining projects,
आदिवासी लोग ने
and
विरोध
also
की
projects for imposing wildlife sanctuaries and displacing people.
तो वहाँ इंडियन स्टेट ने इतने बड़ी बेरहमी से वो आंदोलन को कुचला और कलिंग नगर में 12 जन आदिवासी को कैसे मारा गया काशीपुर आंदोलन में कैसे लोगों
So
को
the
मारा
Indian
गया
state has
ये
also not held
ये
back on
दर्शाता है
repressing
कि
these movements. People have
जितने
been killed,
लोग
people have been jailed, people have
मतलब
been charged with
प्रतिरोध
all kinds
करते
of
हैं
false
और ये
or
इंडियन
serious
स्टेट
charges,
के
including more recently with
पीछे नहीं है
sedition, which is a
उनको
colonial time law.
दबाने में या ब्रूटली
So there is,
वायलेंस
in that
तरीके से
sense, quite
उनको
a struggle going on.
आंदोलन को कुचलने में तो हमारा पहले फेलिक्स जी ने बताया है कि ये जो उड़ीसा का जो हिस्सा है वो छत्तीसगढ़ झारखंड ये पूरा जो ईस्टर्न घाट है और उसमें बहुत सारे खदान के लिए बहुत सारे कंपनी ने ये अपनी क्यू में है और वो खासकर जो पश्चिम केबीके जिले में जहाँ वेस्टर्न
So in
उड़ीसा जहाँ
particular in
मैं
the
रहता हूँ
eastern ghats, that is the
वहाँ
eastern part
बक्साइट
of the mountain
भरपूर
areas
है
in the
जैसे कि
eastern, southern
फेलिक्स ने एक
eastern
जगह
part of
लिखा
India,
है कि
including the state he
ग्वाट का
belongs to in
15%
Odisha, there are a lot of
केबीके में है
minerals.
और
And so
इंडिया
there's
का
a lot of corporate
75%
interest
बक्साइट
in
में
doing mining across
और
that
हर
whole area.
बक्साइट के पीछे
It
भी बहुत
also happens to be a
3-4
predominantly
कंपनी लगे हुए
Adivasi
हैं बहुत
indigenous
जगह
area, and of course also very
कंपनी
well
के विरुद्ध
forested.
लड़ाई चल रहा है एक दो जगह तो
This
माइनिंग भी
contains
हो रहा है और
15% of the
बहुत
world's
जगह अभी
bauxite and
कंपनी
75%
आ
of
रही
India's
है
bauxite. So you can imagine
वहाँ
the corporate interest
प्लांट
in that area.
माइनिंग के लिए
But
और
also, of course,
जबरदस्त
simultaneously, there are a lot
विरोध
of resistance movements
कॉरपोरेट को
against
इंडस्ट्री
this
को
kind of
झेलना पड़ा
mining.
तो ये जो रेजिस्टेंस हो रहा है, ये सिर्फ आदिवासी जो पहले से अपनी कल्चर में है कि अपनी जो जल जंगल जमीन को वो अपनी मतलब गॉड मानता है और पहाड़ को पूजा करता है और प्रकृति के साथ जो रिलेशन है, तो वो एक किस्म का उसका एक दावा है कि वो जल जंगल जमीन को छोड़ के नहीं जाएगा, भले ही उसके लिए वो अपनी जान दे दे। तो ये जो वो बातें हैं आदिवासी के अंदर अपनी प्रकृति को लेकर जो कनेक्शन है और उसको बचाने, उसके लैंग्वेज, उसके कल्चर, उसके जो वाइल्ड को बचाने के लिए जो वो जो ग्रास रूट में जो मूवमेंट हो रहे हैं, ये वो मूवमेंट
It is part of the indigenous
सिर्फ
tradition and culture
मतलब
to revere their
सिर्फ
land
एक
and forests and water.
रिलीजियस में
Basically,
नहीं है,
nature is
जैसे कि
considered to be
वो
like
मतलब
gods and
यानी कि
spirits.
आम लेके
And
आता है।
so
इन लोगों
Adivasis
का
will never leave these
कहिए तो
areas. They'll
मतलब
resist
कि
until
वो लोग अपनी
death.
भी ट्रेडिशनल कल्चर
The
के साथ
resistance has taken many, many
वो
forms,
मतलब उसको
not
रेजिस्ट
just
करते हैं
rallies and
और
demonstrations and things like
एक
that, but
पैरेलल
also in some
एक
cases
गरिल्ला मूवमेंट
armed
भी
defense using
उड़ीसा
their
में
traditional
कुछ दिन
bow and
शुरू
arrow
किया
or
था
other
जिसका
traditional
प्रभाव
weapons,
भी बहुत
and
सारे
in one
जन
case at
आंदोलन
least
में हम लोग
guerrilla
को मिला।
tactics.
Can I just add also that in,
तो ये
sorry, in every demonstration they will carry the bow and arrow and axe. It's quite a symbol of the Adivasi.
Yeah, as a symbol, yes.
तो हाँ, ये जो ब्रूटल वायलेंस जो इंडियन स्टेट और कॉरपोरेट के द्वारा जो आदिवासियों के ऊपर किया जा रहा है, उसके बावजूद भी जो सॉफ्ट वायलेंस है, जो कि हमको उसको बहुत वो अंडरलाइन करना है और आदिवासियों ने इसको समझना शुरू किया है कि जो सॉफ्ट वायलेंस जैसे कि एक्सट्रैक्ट एजुकेशन जो अछूत सामंत या जो
The
स्टेट
state
जो
violence takes many
एजुकेशन दे
forms, not
रखा
just
है,
in terms of killing
वो
and
एक किस्म
imprisonment,
का
etc., but also things
आदिवासियों
like
को
the
मतलब
education, the
एक
kind of education that is
संस्कृति से,
provided in
मूल
these
भूमि
areas. It
से
is very top down. It is
उसको
very
अप्रूव
alienating.
करने का एक
It does
माध्यम है
not build on
और
Adivasi
इसको भी
cultures and
अभी
knowledge. One example he's
आदिवासियों
giving
ने
is an
समझ पाए
institute
हो
called
और
the
ये जो केस जो
Kalinga
कलिंगा
Institute of
इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ सोशल
Social
से जो अच्युत
Sciences or
सामंत
KIST,
हैं,
which
वो
has
ये
30,000
दावा करते हैं कि
Adivasi
वो 30,000
children in
आदिवासियों को
them. The
पढ़ा
or
रहे हैं और
the
उनको
manager, the
चाइल्ड
owner of that
सोशल स्कूल कर
claims that
रहे
he is
हैं,
educating, he's bringing
उसको
these children into
वो जो
civilization.
गवर्नमेंट फर्म का
But
जो
we know that he's
एजुकेशन है उसको
basically alienating them from our
विरोध
own
करना और अल्टरनेटिव
cultures, and we
एजुकेशन
have also
तैयार
started
करने की
protesting against
सोच
this
में भी
kind of
वो
imposed
जन आंदोलन
education
में अभी
and looking
ये
for
सोच
alternatives.
रहे। एंड ये जो इंडिया में ये कॉर्पोरेट फोर्स एंड ब्राह्मणिकल फोर्स हैंड टू हैंड मैन हाथ मिला के आगे आगे जा रहे हैं और वहाँ मतलब आदिवासियों को रजिस्ट करना संभव होता है जहाँ आदिवासियों का ब्राह्मणाइजेशन होता है, मतलब उनके कल्चर को ख़त्म करके हिंदुआइजेशन या ब्राह्मणाइजेशन हो सकता है। होने के बावजूद होने के बाद ही इन लोगों को मतलब और
The
अपनी
one of the
कल्चर, अपनी
tactics that the
ट्रेडिशन में
state
रहते हुए
and
आदिवासियों
Brahminical
को हराना
forces
संभव
use
नहीं है।
is to
इसलिए अभी
Hinduize the
आदिवासियों
Adivasis.
के जो
Adivasis were never
कई
belonging to the
इलाकों
Hindu
में
mainstream religion, but
आदिवासियों का
the
हिंदुआइजेशन का जो प्रक्रिया है
right-wing
वो
Hindu
काफ़ी
forces have been
दूर से चल
claiming
रहा
that
है
they have always been Hindus
और
and
अब
trying to
भी
actually
वो
Hinduize them and make
इंडिविजुअलाइजेशन की
them
वजह
leave
से
their
एक
Adivasi
बड़ा
traditions
विरोध
because they feel that's one way
गंधमाल में जो
to
है
reduce the
हुआ था
resistance
उसको
itself. This is something
आदिवासी
also that the
ने
Adivasi
देख चुके हैं
movements have realized, and they
इसलिए
are trying to
वो
use
उसको भी कैसे
cultural resistance against
कल्चरली
this kind
रेजिस्ट
of
करें उसके ऊपर भी
alienation
ग्रासरूट
or
मूवमेंट के लोग
acculturation by the mainstream
मैंने सोच रहे
religions.
तो अभी पैरेलल एक आर्ट लिटरेचर और एक पैरेलल कल्चरल मूवमेंट ये ग्रासरूट लेवल से शुरू हुआ
So
है
there is
और
a
ये
there
जो
is the beginning
फोर्स
of a
है जो
parallel cultural
ब्राह्मणिकल और
movement
कल्चरल
which
जो फोर्स है
combines
जो कि
also,
पूरा
of course, the ecological
नेचुरल इश्यूज पे
aspects, because
रिसर्च कर रहा
without
है उनको
both
समझे
being
बिना
seen together, we will not
इकोलॉजी
be
की
able to
बात नहीं
understand
कर सकते।
what's
थैंक यू।
happening on the ground and with these movements. हेमंत जी हो गया आपका?
हाँ हाँ, हो गया, थैंक यू।
Would you like to share one poem? Because you are a poet, just do you have one in your mind?
No, but actually, when we are in jail now, after burning the Vedantas go down, we were translating some poems of Kurdish writers. One of my favorite writers is Sarpo Bekas. I want to recite one poem actually. That will I will recite later on. That's all.
You can recite now if you like, and then we'll move on to Ashish. Why not?
Yeah, uh, कविता का नाम Storm Tide. Storm Tide. The tide said to the fisherman. The tide said to the fisherman, there are many reasons why my waves are in rage. The most important is that I am for the freedom of the fish and against the land. Thank you.
Thank you so much, really. Now, without more ado, would you like to? Yeah, really brilliant introduction, Hemant. Thank you. Ashish, will you go next? And Marco, will you share his screen?
Yes, thanks. Sorry, Felix?
Introduce yourself a bit too, of course.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, yeah. So my name is Ashish Kothari. I work in Pune in Western India with an organization called Kalpavriksha, which is a 44-year-old ecological action group. But we work a lot on the interface between so-called development, ecology, environment, livelihoods, and the rights of communities, including Adivasi communities. And over the last couple of decades, also a search for radical alternatives, which is what I will primarily focus on. We have a national platform called Alternatives Confluence or Vikalp Sangam, and a global one called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, which has three Kurdish groups also in it, but I'll introduce that at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to speak about something called eco-swaraj. I'll introduce that a bit later, but basically, next slide. We all understand that we are in the midst of multiple global crises, also being called the poly crisis, of which, of course, ecological is what our focus today, but it is interconnected with all the other different crises that we know of, and they manifest themselves in many different ways. Next slide. Part of this is also the model of development that has been imposed across the world, including in India. So what Hemant was talking about, if you look at this image of how, what we think of forests when we want to lay a pipeline, where it's basically nature is seen as a barrier which has to be uprooted for so-called development. What we see across the world, including in India, is violence of many forms in the name of development, and a move towards what I call away from livelihoods, which were occupations that were connected to the ecology, to culture, to society, to what I call deadlihoods, which are occupations or jobs that are totally unconnected to everything else around us. Next slide. We've also seen during the COVID pandemic how governments have actually used this as an opportunity for more authoritarianism, and corporations have used it as a uh, opportunity for more profit making. But we also have seen the most incredible human expressions of solidarity, of people helping each other out, and people expressing resilience in many different ways. And that's the part that I want to focus on much more in today's presentation. Next slide, please. So, one of the most important things we need to understand, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with this, is that the same system that has created the problems, whether it's capitalism or racism or casteism or whatever, patriarchy, is also giving us what it calls solutions. And we know that, these are market solutions or techno fixes or other kinds of things. And we know that most of these are, or all of them, are either false or very partial solutions, because they don't actually get to the root of the crises, which is the structures of inequality and unsustainability, which is what I want to talk about in terms of the alternatives that people are coming up with. Next slide. One of the, obviously, then as we resist, as people like Hemanta and others across the world are resisting, the question that we always come up with for ourselves, and what the public is also asking us, well, okay, what's your solution? What are your alternatives to meeting human needs and aspirations? And I feel that there are two kinds. One is exactly what the next slide. One is what Hemanta has been talking about, which is resistance. Because in these forms of resistance, the narratives that come out challenge the fundamental structures of injustice, inequality, and unsustainability, including what you see on the slide there, and including also, of course, casteism, which Hemanta spoke about. But the other important reason why resistance movements are also alternatives is that they they also express different ways of relating to the rest of nature and to each other. This particular photograph is from the late 1980s, a movement against two mega hydroelectricity projects in central India on the Indravati River, where 300 Adivasi villages got together and said not just that they don't want to be displaced and drowned by these dams, but also that the river, which for the government is electricity and megawatts, for us, she is our mother. And you can actually see in that, and exactly what Hemant was speaking about, that nature is viewed in terms of its own spirit. It has life. It is something that is that we are part of and we're closely connected to. So there are, next slide, there are these expressions in these resistance movements of very different ways of being, of knowing, of dreaming, of acting, of behaving with each other and with the rest of nature. We see these in resistance movements all over the world, including the iconic farmers movement that Felix mentioned briefly, but also movements against racism, for peace, the climate justice movements, youth movements, etc. Next slide. The second kind of alternative, which I think is very important, Marco, if you could just keep clicking, you'll see, yeah, is of people building constructive pathways of meeting basic needs and aspirations without causing the sorts of problems that the current model of development causes. We've been documenting these across India. We have a website which I'll be at the end, which has 2,000 stories of these kinds of radical transformations on the ground. Next slide. I'm going to give you just a quick glimpse of some of them, which I have found very inspiring. This comes from the most oppressed section of India's society, which is Dalit women farmers. Now, Dalit, as you know, are the so-called outcasts in India in Hindu society. As women, they are disprivileged in patriarchal, and of course, they're very small farmers, 1 acre, 2 acres of land. So, from a caste, class, and patriarchal lens, they are disprivileged. Over the last 30 years, this group of about 5,000 Dalit women farmers have collectivized a lot of their operations, basically got together as communities, shared seeds, brought back a lot of their traditional knowledge and seeds and ways of agriculture, completely organic. And through all of that, been able to not just remove their situation of hunger and malnutrition and so on, but achieve not just food security, but food sovereignty, complete control over everything to do with food, total autonomy in that sense with food. Oh, there's a message from Steve saying slides are not moving for him. Is that they are moving for me, so I don't know if anybody else.
They will be probably. Can you go to the next one? Do you want the next one yet?
Yeah, no, I was just finishing with this one, so perhaps. Okay, so if they're moving, that's fine. And also through all of this, then they have their own media center. They do a whole bunch of things. And through that, also been able to challenge and transform their situation in terms of women, much more respect for women, and moving away from their caste identities. Next slide. This the next one is an example from central India of Adivasi India, where 90 villages, who were also part of the anti-dam movement that I spoke about earlier, they have gotten together as a federation of Gram Sabhas, that is village assemblies, to assert their self-determination over that entire region, to protect their forests, to generate livelihoods based on land and forests using their own knowledge. Also, the women within the community saying that we want also equal voice within the community, not just equal voice vis-a-vis the government. And so empowerment process at the women, and of course, asserting their own cultural identity, the kinds of movements, again, that Hemant was speaking about. Next slide. We move up north to the Himalaya. This is an example of a women's collective which has transformed the lives of women there through the revival of their traditional craft skills, but also the use of community-led ecotourism. That is to say, when there are visitors coming here for trekking or bird watching or other things, they actually stay in the homes of these women, and which gives them a little bit of earning, but also for the visitors, it's an important cultural and ecological experience. Very unlike the mass tourism that unfortunately damages and ruins most parts of the country. Next slide. This example is from a city because it's also, India is a rapidly urbanizing country, and we know that cities are facing, they're groaning again under huge amounts of pressures. Mostly the poorest people in the cities don't have access to the kind of civic amenities that they should have access to. So here, this is an example in Western India of a city where local communities in many of the colonies have gotten together to assert their role in the decision making with regard to what happens in their settlements, and decision making for the city as a whole. That is to say, much more radical democracy on the ground for city areas also. Next slide. And one of the things we did during the last 3 years was to look at examples across India of where communities were able to cope much better with the COVID pandemic, both in terms of health, but also more importantly, in terms of economic livelihoods. Because when the Indian government imposed very drastic economic lockdown almost overnight, not almost, in fact, within 4 hours, um, the economy of millions of people basically collapsed. But these were communities. We have 70 examples across India of communities that were able to do much better because they had localized economies, they had their own food self-sufficiency, they had community systems intact, or were able to revive those community systems of decision making and solidarity and so on. So these are really great examples of where communities, when they achieve some levels of self-determination, able to cope with even the worst of the crises, health crises or economic crises. Next slide. We also then have many examples of where both media and technology, which is otherwise controlled by the corporations or by the government, these are examples where people are trying to create alternative technologies and alternative media, and to democratize technology and media so that it is in fact for the benefit of people and in the control of people, and also ecologically much more sustainable, unlike most of the technologies that are being developed by corporations across the world. Next slide. And finally, in terms of, I think, positive examples, Hemant mentioned the challenge of alternative education. So we've also been seeing or working with and documenting alternative education experiences in different parts of India, in Adivasi societies, in Dalits, in many different kinds of communities, where the experience of learning is with and within the community, where it is not just cramming information into the head, but also learning hand skills and learning values through working within the community, and expressing creativity and talent, which is naturally inborn in children rather than being suppressed in the sort of formal education system that we otherwise have. This is really important because we realize in the colonial times, one of the most important ways by which the British colonized us was to colonize our minds through the education system, exactly what Hemant was talking about. So we need these alternatives to break out of that kind of colonial education system, which unfortunately still continues in most parts of India. Next slide. Now, I want to try and put these, okay, usually in my presentations, I also give many examples from other parts of the world. If you could just click a few times. We have this book, which I'll introduce at the end. Okay, I'm going to switch off my video because that might be taking more power than this. Yes, okay, so I was talking about these examples across the world. And of course, next slide. One of the examples I always give is of the Kurdish movement, which I don't need to talk about here, okay, so we can skip this slide. The next one is also to look at, just to give examples of non-capitalist social and solidarity businesses in Europe, in the midst of the most capitalist, industries or societies in the world. Things like time banking, alternative currencies, worker-owned production processes where there is no boss, where every worker gets exactly the same wage per hour of work, regardless of the kind of work that's being done, and many other such examples. You can click a few times and then go to the next slide, please. So putting all of these different examples together, the kind of framework of radical alternatives that's emerging in India, in this process that we've been running for the last few years, we've sort of come up with, in conversation with communities across the country, we've come up with this, what we call the flower of transformation. where we're looking at radical changes, systemic changes taking place in 5 spheres of life: the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, and the ecological. Next slide. Just to give a quick glimpse of some of these transformations, I don't have the time to go into too much. For instance, with democracy, people are saying democracy is not about elections. It's about us claiming power where we are, whether it's a village or an urban neighborhood or an education institution or an NGO or whatever it is. But along with that, also then has to be the democratic control over the economy and bringing back levels of self-reliance, especially for basic needs, bringing back an economy of caring and sharing that goes well beyond just financialization, bringing back commons versus privatization, and then obviously through all of this going well beyond GDP as an indicator, which GDP is a completely nonsensical indicator of well-being anyway, to actually look at meaningful indicators of well-being. All of this goes hand in hand with the third sphere, which is the struggles for equality and against discrimination. And the fourth sphere, which is the assertion of cultural diversity and knowledge diversity, traditional knowledge, modern knowledge, different kinds of ways of knowing and being, and the commons, in knowledge especially in the commons rather than privatized. And finally, next slide, the fifth sphere is about us reintegrating ourselves within ecology. I remember in school, when I was doing my school in biology, I was taught that we are a pyramid of life with human beings at the top, the left side figure, and you can see that it's actually the man on top. But Adivasis have always taught us that it's actually a circle of life, with all life forms being equally respected, and therefore not just the rights of human beings, but also the rights of nature. You can click again, please. Next slide. And then, so one of the most interesting ways in which we can actually look at all of this together is to start reimagining boundaries, political boundaries. So South Asia, as an example, has been divided up into nation states for various historical reasons, including colonialism. And what this has done is to disrupt ecological flows and cultural flows. For instance, rivers are shared now between 3 countries or 4 countries, and one country doing something on its river causes a huge problem downstream. For instance, India has a barrage across the Ganga, which creates problems for Bangladesh. China is currently building something in a river which comes into India, becomes a Brahmaputra, building a huge dam, which will cause problems for us. We are thinking of building a dam on the Indus, which will cause problems for Pakistan. Similarly, people who were able to move back and forth, nomadic populations, traders, etc., are now stuck because they're all fences with armies on both sides. So, can we start reimagining South Asia as a ecological, a biocultural, and ecological region where these boundaries actually start getting resolved? Now, it's obviously a very difficult vision to implement, but at least let's start thinking about it. Next slide. And so the final thing I think that is very important for us is we have all these sorts of examples all across the world. What brings us together? What can we think of as being the common threads across these different alternatives? And here I think the core of this flower of transformation is the values, the ethics. Next slide. And the ones that we have learned from the community initiatives all over India. If you could keep clicking, please. Across India is this set of values, which is kind of common. This is expressed in many different ways. There are different terms and words used for it across the world. But in some senses, what we're looking at is that this set of values, which is completely different from the set of values or ethics or lack of ethics that the currently dominant system tells us, is what in some senses are the common threads for all of us. Next slide. So, in terms of the worldviews that kind of express these sorts of values and these strategies I've been mentioning, in India, something we're talking about is bringing back the notion of Swaraj, which means self rule, but also eco Swaraj, which means self rule with nature also being part of it. And it's a very simple idea that we're talking about all people being decision makers, not just politicians and bureaucrats. But as we take decisions wherever we are responsible to other people and to other species. So you bring in notions of equality, equity, justice, sustainability through that kind of decision making. Next slide. There are similar notions across the world. many from ancient indigenous peoples, Adivasis across the world, which are coming back in current struggles. Also, the radical reinterpretations of major religions, such as liberation theology in Christianity or socially engaged Buddhism and others. And then, of course, also worldviews emerging from within the capitalist societies, such as degrowth in Europe or ecofeminism in many parts of the world. And again, to reiterate, this is a pluriverse. It's an enormous diversity of worldviews and solutions that are emerging or re-emerging. And but in that pluriverse, I think what binds us together is that set of values that I put up earlier. Next slide. Um, Final question. A lot of people ask, how do all these thousands of alternatives come together to form a macro change, a macro shift? How do we deal with the larger forces of capitalism and statism and patriarchy and capitalism and so on? And I think what's happening, beginning to happen in many parts of the world, is that we're not talking about copying each other's examples. We're not talking about upscaling, which is to say a single example becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. We're talking about outscaling, learning from each other, doing our own things, and then connecting across larger landscapes and seascapes, across geographies, across cultures. Really very much what the Kurdish movement is trying to do, or what the Zapatista movement has been trying to do. And through that kind of networking connection horizontally, we try and create the scale of transformation. Next slide. And two processes we're involved with which help to do this. One is called Vikalp Sangam, or the confluence of alternatives. We have about 90 movements and organizations across India that come together and share and collaborate and do collective visioning of what kind of a future we need. Hemantaji, I will be inviting you also to join this if you'd like to. Next slide. This includes physical confluences, meeting in different parts of the world to talk about what's happening in that region or on particular topics and themes. And next slide, also documenting stories of hope, which can inspire other people to do this. This is the website, which has about 2,000 such stories so far, and one is being added every couple of days. Next slide. Learning from this, we then also initiated this global tapestry in 2019. It's an attempt to try and horizontally connect across the world the kind of alternative movements all over the world with similar objectives. Next slide. There is about 60, 65 global or regional networks and organizations that are involved, including 3 Kurdish movement organizations, CDC, ADM, and Genealogy Academy, and many, many others. And it's basically trying to create spaces of dialogue and collective action at a more global level. Next slide. I think this is my last slide. This is a website which also has stories of radical transformation from different parts of the world. The previous one was for India. This one is more global. I'll put up links to all of these in the chat as soon as I finish. Next slide. I think so. Yeah, I hope I was able to give some idea. Oh, sorry, these are also publications which have much more available on this. Next slide. Thanks a lot for this opportunity, and I hope I was able to give a little bit of glimpse of what's happening here in India, and also what the global manifestations of that are. Thank you.
Actually, absolutely superb talk. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
Can we stop the screen share now? I would like to take 5 minutes now and then start the discussion, just to tie up a few of the points that's been made. The first one, what Hemant and Ashish both talked about, displacement on a scale you cannot imagine. And the link with the mining comes across when you understand India now is the number 2 producer of steel, aluminium, coal, and many other things after China. And China is diminishing, India is coming up. And, you know, when we were writing the book about aluminium 15, 20 years ago, India was number 5 or 6. Now it's number 2. That the pressure for mining is beyond what you can imagine. So one of the interesting things, one of the things to understand, the link between mining metals and the armed industry. So you're imposing terror through the armed forces in order to create weapons of terror. I think this is a very important thing for understanding these movements. Then if we understand he mentioned the Kashipur movement, which was the first movement I really became involved in his part of South Odisha against bauxite mining, where we saw a very strong movement for 5, 10, 15 years. And then finally the corporations and the paramilitaries came and they built a new aluminium factory mining a sacred mountain called Baplamani. And the symbol of the protest is often the Adivasis go out on the streets and they walk miles with a bow and arrow, with an axe on the shoulder, which is just they don't usually use it, but it's to show that they are prepared to defend, as it were. And then one of the interesting things to understand also that nobody's mentioned very much in Bengal, some of the strongest movements against Singur and Nandigram. That was a new car factory of Tata and a new chemical plant from Indonesia. Massive resistance, but often more by Dalits or small farmers. Adivasis came from Odisha to support them, and it was a communist government in West Bengal who was imposing that in collusion with the World Bank. So that's to understand the role that sometimes the Communist Party of India, Marxists especially, CPM, they tend to be rather ruthless about the industrialization, going in considering capitalism a necessary stage. They also imposed the industrialization. I wanted to bring out Ashish's point about language too, because he talked about education. Like every Adivasi will speak their own language, which is a very ancient language, and these are almost completely banned from school. So that's a very important link with the Kurdish issue, where language is such a key issue. So, for example, Hemant has told me how, his own language, Gondi, is one of the most ancient languages of India, but hardly any school there allowed to speak it, while Sanskrit is being imposed in this Brahminical mindset, as it were. It's a beautiful language, Sanskrit, but it's not, in some ways, it's not as indigenous to India as the Adivasi languages are. And he mentioned KISS, the big school that some of you will know I've been part of the resistance to, and 30,000 only Adivasi students on one campus, funded by mining industries. Can you imagine the implications of the brainwashing? And they even have UN funding to do multilingual education, but they do a token education. And people who've been involved in that have told us it's just they learn a song. They don't learn to discuss and talk about things in these Adivasi languages, which have such democratic wealth of thinking about things as a democracy and nature and humans together. Hemant also mentioned the wildlife sanctuaries issue, that if you see the wild parts of India, there are 500 or 600 sanctuaries or wildlife parks. And it's as if wild India is being divided up. Okay, that's a national sacrifice area for the industries. And these ones are for the wildlife. So the Adivasis, they're hunting, so remove them. That's why bow and arrow is a very, it's a multi-level symbol, as it were. I think that's all I wanted to say before. I think now it's time to start the discussion. And Conor, may I ask you to chair this discussion? So people please bring questions and we can discuss more. Anybody there? Can you hear me? Conor?
I don't think it's working, Connor.
Yes. Hopefully it's working. Felix? Yeah, you were here. Felix, do you just want to pick up where you were? I think everything's okay now.
Did I cut out for a bit? I'm sorry, I didn't.
We were cut out a little bit. Yeah. No, that's okay though. The last week you were talking about wildlife.
Talking about what Hemant was saying and what Ashish was also saying, how Adivasis really have an inclusive nature and people living together. But what's been imposed is not just the industrialization, which is like what they call in America, national sacrifice areas. Okay, destroy those mountains, destroy those rivers, but we'll keep the wildlife there. But then those areas too, where Adivasis have always lived in basic harmony with the wildlife, they are being thrown out too. So it's, sometimes the wildlife experts or environmentalists are as oppressive or they work alongside the industry. And this is where Ashish Kothari is actually a very significant person, because he held out always the tribal rights or the farmers' rights alongside the movements against industrialization. The two have to go together, the political, the ecological, and so on. Anyway, Ashish, you gave such a masterful talk, and both of you, I'm sure people want to ask questions. So you take over now, please, Kunal.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much to both of our speakers, to Hemant and to Ashish. Both really, really great talks. Thank you very much for joining us both. Thank you, Felix, for introducing and moderating and sharing your points at the end. So now we'd like to open it up for discussions and questions. Is there anyone who would like to start with any questions initially?
I don't have a question, but I do want to thank the people who spoke. It was incredibly illuminating. Thank you very much for a systematic explanation of what's going on.
Absolutely. Agreed. Thank you both very much. Liz?
Yes, thanks for the presentations. I have been following alternative agendas of rural people in India and elsewhere for a long time. And I noticed many similarities between the Adivasi resistance and alternatives on the one hand, and more generally, resistance by rural people, especially women. Now, of course, the Adivasis are in a different situation because of their location, often in mineral-rich areas, which makes them special targets of the plunder. But as regards the resistance, I wonder how have they and others found interfaces or connections between their alternative visions and practices and those of other rural people?
हेमंता, आप इसका रिस्पॉन्स देना चाहेंगे? आपको
यहाँ
समझ आ रहा?
हाँ, यहाँ बहुत सारे दोस्त भी हैं, शरण्या, राजा। हाँ, अभी उन लोग भी ये खासकर शरण्या ये वुमेन वाला क्वेश्चन को एड्रेस कर सकते हैं। शरण्या।
हाँ, पर खाली विमेन का नहीं था, ये भी था कि आदिवासी मूवमेंट्स और जो बाकी समुदाय के मूवमेंट्स हैं, उन दोनों के बीच में किस तरह के लिंक्स या कनेक्शंस हैं, वो भी था।
Yes, actually, I already told that the Western Odisha is a part of the Eastern Ghat Mountain, and the most of the mountains are reserved in bauxite. So, in recent year, a new phenomena has been developed that all the various Adivasi group, those who are fighting for their livelihood and their nature and mountain, they have been process has been initiated to coordinate each other in a certain platform. So all the mining area to mining movement like Niyamgiri movement, Khandwala Mali movement, and Mali Parbat movement, they all movement are coded to one another, and women are playing major roles in this moment, and different women from different movement are going to another movement and exchanging their views and presenting their resistance.
Yeah, just to add to that quickly, I think to add to what Hemanta is saying, this is happening a lot in some states like Odisha, but also nationally, we have forums like the National Alliance of People's Movements, where both Adivasi and other movements are able to get together and express solidarity, be with each other, help when movements are in trouble. And this includes also Dalit movements, fisher movements, and so on. So there are some platforms where this kind of coming together, and also other civil society organizations like the one I work with are able to offer support to these.
Lost.
Okay.
Please.
Connor, I think you're not, you're frozen, Connor.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, maybe it's just my fault. Sorry.
Shivanya, are you there? Because Hemant just invited you to say something. If you are, you or Raja, it would be good to hear from you at this point. Shivanya and Raja are in the same area of Odisha as Hemant.
Can I ask a naive question?
Cool.
Can you hear me? Felix, can you hear me?
You ask, please.
Yeah. So with respect to, we hear a lot about Gandhi in the West, and people, the terminology of Swaraj is very much linked up to Gandhi when I've seen it before. And with respect to on the question of self-defense in particular, it seems like there's a difference of opinion with respect to what Swaraj entails, because this is a more militant self-defense kind of version. Am I right to think of it, to think of this development along such lines, or am I just being ignorant?
This question is for you, Ashish, especially.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jeff, I think, I mean, if you're asking about the militant movements in central and eastern India, which include armed resistance, then yes, that would be, I mean, there would be serious differences of opinion between, say, Gandhi and those movements. But if you're talking about, for instance, the kind of movements that Hemanta is speaking about, where there is a show of arms, but not an intent to use those arms except for self-defense, which is very similar to the Kurdish movement, you will actually find that Gandhi has very explicitly said that he would prefer violence as self-defense rather than cowardly acceptance of a situation. So of course he would prefer nonviolence, but he says that we. So I mean, I often think in my own head of a imaginary conversation between Oshalan or the Kurdish women's movement and Gandhi, and what that would sound like. And I think it would be very interesting. I'm actually feeling to write it up. I think it would be very interesting because even though there was a very strong adherence to nonviolence in Gandhi, in his own writings, he actually does say that nonviolence as a form of running away from the enemy or not defending oneself is worse than defending oneself with arms. So if that's exactly what Hemanta said, that we're actually showing these arms as a form of self-defense. So in that sense, maybe there isn't so much of a difference of opinion.
Yeah.
But what happens with some of the so-called Naxalite movement in central and eastern India, I think that would be a bit different because they're also proactively killing people. Now, of course,
Yeah.
they're saying they kill people who represent the state, but in the process also, of course, people, Adivasis and all are also being killed. So that's a bit of a different situation than
Yeah.
I think the movements that Hemanta is talking about. But Hemanta, please add.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, by the way.
हम ये देखेंगे कि जब एक रेजिस्टेंस होता है किसी मूवमेंट में, तो जो बहुत सारे विचारधारा के लोग रहते हैं, अच्छे जी थोड़ा ट्रांसलेट कर दीजिए, हाँ? तो जब जो रेजिस्टेंस मूवमेंट रहता है कहीं-कहीं तो जब विभिन्न फर्म का जो रेजिस्टेंस होता है, तो जो बहुत सारे जो आइडियोलॉजी वाले लोग होते हैं, जैसे कि कोई गांधीयन हो, कोई अम्बेडकराइट हो, तो उन लोगों का रोल वहाँ कैसा रहता है? यहाँ से पता चलता है कि वो जो स्वराज वाले गांधी एक्चुअली वो रेजिस्टेंस मूवमेंट में उनका रोल क्या था? एक्चुअली देखा गया है कि गांधीयन पर्सपेक्टिव में गांधी का भी जो रोल देखा गया, जब स्ट्रक्चर वायलेंस करता है, तो वो चुप रहते हैं और जब पीपल रेजिस्ट करते हैं या बहुत सारा एग्जाम्पल है, जब पीपल रेजिस्ट करते हैं, तो उनको वायलेंस नहीं करने की सलाह देते हैं, अहिंसा बरतने की सलाह देते हैं। तो वैसे ये जो वायलेंस इधर आदिवासी मूवमेंट में ये वायलेंस नहीं है। वैसे मैं बताया कि ये मतलब कि वायलेंस के लिए कोई आंच नहीं पकड़ता। और उनके ऊपर जो स्टेट के मिलिट्री फोर्स से, लोकल गुंडा से जो ये हुआ था, मतलब उनके ऊपर जो ब्रूटल वायलेंस होता है, उसको रजिस्ट करते हैं। नियमगिरी का जो बात मैं बोल रहा था, हम लोग जो गोडाउन के पुराने जलाने के जो एलिगेशन में हम लोग जेल गए थे, वो तब लोगों ने वो मतलब गोडाउन को जला दिया, जब वहाँ का गुंडा लोग ने उनको मतलब पीट-पीट के गाँव तक ले आए थे। तो वो उसी पर उनका रेजिस्टेंस हुआ कि मतलब काउंटर वायलेंस हुआ कि उन लोगों ने जाके गोदाम जला दी। तो आदिवासियों ने कभी वायलेंस अपनी तरफ से शुरू नहीं की, रेजिस्ट कर रहे हैं। और गांधीयन क्या है कि वो किसी फर्म का भी जो रेजिस्टेंस का वायलेंस को भी वो वायलेंस जैसे देखते हैं। थैंक यू।
Okay, Hemanta is saying that the role of Gandhians in the current times, with looking at the movements now, has been not really very supportive of these movements, militant movements on the ground. Um, and in fact, has been to advise that you should not use violence, etc. But our resistance has always been not to use, this is what I said earlier, not to use violence proactively, but only as a means of self defense. One of the examples he's giving is that they had burnt the storehouse, the godown of Vedanta Corporation in Odisha. And this is where they were then accused of being violent, etc. But essentially, the Vedanta corporation had unleashed what we call gundas, that is thugs, on them who were doing a lot of violence on the Adivasi people. So they basically did this burning of the godown as an act of self-defense. And that's their only use of violence in some senses.
Thank you. I see we have a point from Nick, but before then, I just Felix mentioned before we have Sharanya here. I just want to see if Sharanya would like to weigh in at all.
Hi, Felix. Hello, everyone. Johar. So I actually, Felix, missed your point. What did you want me to share?
Felix, you were muted. You were muted now.
Joanna, it was Hemant who wanted to bring you in, and I forget what the point was, but do feel free to come in at any point. And another person who I'm very, very happy to see is Sridhar Ramamurthy, who is just joined, and he is doing unbelievable work in so many legal cases around the country to support movements. Sridhar, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Sorry, I could just join in now.
It's great to see you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question for clarification?
Before, yeah, sure.
Just a quick clarification. When you say that they're unleashing thugs, are you using that term to refer to one of the tribes that are called thugs, or are you using
Yeah, no.
it metaphorically?
No, I mean either police or people who are basically hired by the corporations and sometimes by the state
Okay.
to unleash violence on movements. So yeah, no, not. Yeah, I know the origin of the word thug itself is problematic. So maybe I should
Sure.
not have used.
The origin of the word thug is very interesting, but thug or gunda means hired hitman.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which industrial corporation uses.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so first I'll turn it over. Sharanya, there's some messages in the chat around is around the question of women. I don't know if Sharanya or Malvika.
Just read. I just read. I mean, okay. No, I mean, like on the role of, not role, but like, how women see especially indigenous, tribal, or Adivasi women see resistance. And so, from my experiences with say the different movements in anti-mining, especially anti-mining movements in the southern part of Odisha, where most of my experience has been, that the women actually bring in the perspective or the discourse of the the land as a sacred. And many of the women, many of the male led discourses of resistance look at resources more as a economic materialistic relationship that communities have for their livelihood, their economic survival. But it's the women, and many of the women in indigenous communities are the who lead are actually the shamans, or the priestesses, the healers. And they bring in the whole narrative of the land, the forest, as a sacred space, as part of a life world. And it is that which is very, very, for me, very, very critical to understanding, you know the counter understanding, or the counter narrative to what the state pushes, imposes on Adivasi resistance movements, that we are doing this for your development, we are doing this for your economic betterment. But when you are countered that we are actually fighting not because this is a resource for us, but because this is who we are. The forest makes who we are. The land is our identity. And you cannot compensate this. You cannot, uh, what development will you bring when you are going to destroy our identity, our life worlds, our sacred, our, knowledge systems, belief systems? How will you do them? And that's where I think the state actually loses the narrative. And for me, that's very, very important. Yeah, that's a very important narrative in a Adivasi resistance. So apart from they being in the front lines, apart from they being, the leadership, and Adivasi societies can also undermine the agency of women, but they are able to assert their agency within movements, within leaderships of Adivasi movements or tribal indigenous movements, because of this understanding of ecology, or land, forest, habitats, sacred groves, and everything else.
Thank you very much, Sharanya, for sharing that. That's really important and beautiful, really. So thank you very much. Um, Nick, I believe you had a point you wanted to make before. No. Okay. Well, if Nick,
I think you might have been. I lost contact. I think you might have as well. Nick, Connor was calling on you to say something.
okay, he may be unavailable. Oh, there we are. Okay, he may be unavailable at this point. But if he comes back, we'll turn over to him.
Well, here we go.
Okay.
That's well. First of all, I wanted to say thank you very, very much to Hemant and Ashish for their, wonderful presentations, and also for the last intervention as well, was from Sharanya, which was superb. In a way, actually, what I was going to say was somewhat surpassed, but I did have one quick question. One thing to reflect on. I was stimulated by actually. I was remembering that actually, Ashish, I think the first time we were in touch with each other was 40 years ago, on that book on dams. So it's been a long, long time. And I was reflecting that at that time in the early 80s, particularly among social movements in India and more broadly, actually, the critique of development was much more, or seemed to be much more at the fore than perhaps it is in many more mainstream movements today. That it wasn't, the dams were opposed not just because they were displacing people. They were, most of the 60 million who have been displaced by dams, but not just for technological reasons but because of the trajectory of development that they imposed. And I wonder whether one can reflect a bit on why that critique of development, particularly not just of capitalist development, but of state capitalist development and just much more generally of the development model, has somehow gone into the background a bit, and in a way been replaced, certainly amongst mainstream civil society, by a sort of rather technocratic critique, which is, the problem is that people aren't enforcing social and environmental safeguard policies, or it's as long as we get the rule book right on human rights, that these technologies will be fine, and so on. What's happened that's somewhat deracinated that critique of development from the mainstream? I mean, it's still very live at the grassroots, I know, but why is it? What has been the problem? Is it a problem of class, or is it something to do with the alliances that have been made? What was your reflection and that of Hemant on that?
Thanks, Nick. I think that's a very important question. And hi, wonderful to see after all these decades. And of course, fond memories of our good friend Teddy Goldsmith. So, I think, this is a crucial question. I think there are two or three things that have happened. One is I would say, the sort of NGOization of the ecological and other movements. So as a civil society has got more and more money, more and more so-called professional and formalized, it's actually been taken over by these humongous, huge NGOs in many parts of the world, including in India. And these NGOs, their whole upbringing, the way they work, etc., is itself highly formalized and corporatized. And so for them, the market fixes and the managerial fixes and, things like that kind of appeal much more. It comes to them much more naturally.
We may have a technical issue there, or at least on my end. I think, Ashish, you have cut out. Perhaps we can tune into Hemanta until Ashish comes back. Hemanta, would you like to comment anything about the question?
Actually, I cannot understand the question, actually.
Okay.
Hi, sorry.
Ashish is here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, was Hemanta speaking, or should I continue?
No. Ashish, you can.
Okay, let me just finish that. Yeah. So anyway, so one is, I think that's something that's happened. We have, for decades, people have been saying there should be more money in the civil society sector, but that more money has also created these sorts of problems. The second is that there's a lot more appetite for compromise. As people who've been struggling for many, many years, sometimes many decades, see that the system isn't really moving, you feel a bit more inclined to say, well, okay, if we can do some reforms, then let's at least go there rather than continue asking for radical shifts and changes. But really, I think this is what's happening in the urban NGO civil society spaces. If you look at the people's movements on the ground, such as the ones that Hemanta represents, they're still challenging the fundamentals of it, including the model of development. In India, for instance, the National Alliance for People's Movements, which has dozens of such movements, continues to challenge the model of development itself and the statist capitalist patriarchy structures underlying it. And also, I think what's happening in many parts of the world is to challenge this also in the form of economic growth as a god, to actually really fundamentally challenge the economic growth models themselves, including, of course, as you know, from some of the degrowth movements in Europe and elsewhere, but essentially also from the people's movements of resistance in the global south. So it's a mix. I think the picture is a bit of a mix. But because the urban NGOs tend to dominate media and writing and all of that, we kind of see that, I think, a little bit more than what the people's movements on the ground are doing. So that's my impression of things, Nick.
Thank you, Ashish. I just wanted to ask if Bogmunda, you'd like to say anything before you go. No, you're muted. No, still muted. Press it once. No sound.
It seems now you're unmuted, but yeah, we cannot hear you. It might be something with the browsers, unfortunately. There's
It's okay. We
Missions.
just all we're so happy to see you, Agmander.
absolutely.
I'll have to come visit you.
I feel the same, Bogmunda. One day I'm going to come to Iceland and see what you're doing there.
Yeah,
Yes.
I would like to echo and third that. Very nice to see you, Gunders. Thank you. So we had a question in the chat before from Steve. Steve, maybe I could turn it over to you, and you could ask it if you like.
Okay, thanks, Connor. Yeah, thanks so much, Hemant and Ashish. My question was around just a little bit more detail on the food systems and the self-sufficiency systems that you mentioned with respect to the Adivasis. So you talked about them being underpinned by knowledge commons. I was just interested to know a little bit more about what those food systems are and to what extent the traditional food systems are still intact today. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, Steve. So I think, one of the most important aspects of the traditional food systems, Adivasi and also non-Adivasi traditional food systems, is their site specificity. They're highly tuned to the local ecosystems, and of course, they are generations of knowledge that has built up, which being used in these traditional systems. They're biologically extremely diverse in terms of the use of seeds or livestock, animal husbandry, fisheries, etc. One can say much more, but broadly, that's the kind of thing. Now, what has happened with the Indian Green Revolution, so-called Green Revolution over the last 5-6 decades, is that the government has basically tried to push these out and bring in monocultures with chemicals, more cash cropping rather than food, etc. And where now there is resistance, so in many cases, people have shifted to these new forms, and now they're suffering the consequences of that. So either you have some traditional systems which have not been impacted by the Green Revolution model, especially where they're far away from the centers of power, or you have in areas where they've been impacted, where people are coming back with their traditional systems, their more biologically diverse systems, such as the example I gave you of the 5,000 Dalit women farmers, or many Adivasi movements also in Odisha, for instance, are coming back with asserting or coming back with their diverse traditional systems. But they're still having to face adverse government policy. And so in a sense, it's swimming against the tide. But one of the strategies a lot of them are using is to build relationships with consumers, sensitive consumers in the nearest towns or wherever it's possible, and also create more local exchanges so that they have food security for themselves, but also a little bit of the market, in local markets where they can sell these foods so that they can get some incomes. So these are the sorts of strategies that are being tried out for food security, food sovereignty in Adivasi and other communities, different parts of India. There's a lot written about this. I'd be happy to send you links to stuff of what's happening in India. If you, I can put my email in the chat, and if you send me a mail, I can send you references.
Well, that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
To complement what Ashish had just said, seeds are very, very important. One of Ashish's photographs showed the sharing of seeds, the keeping of traditional sheaves, insisting on keeping the use of seeds that the corporations are trying to ban, that they're trying to sell seeds. It's, so strong, these organic movements in India, as some of you will know.
Yeah. And if I can, I put a lot of links in the chat. If you can just maybe copy them in some places. So those, a lot of those documents also have case studies of food sovereignty and a number of other things, including some examples that I gave you. So you'll find much more material there and on the website.
I've copied them. Thanks. Right. Yeah. So to what the Adivasis been involved with the wider farmers movement? Just as a supplementary question.
Yes, is the short answer.
Okay.
I can see Pradyumna.
Yes. Please.
Pradyumna, do you want to see?
Yeah. Thanks Ashish and Hemanta for the wonderful presentations. And now I have a question for Ashish. Not exactly a question, but a kind of apprehension that uh, I want to raise here. During his presentation, he mentioned of this community-based ecotourism, and he mentioned it as an alternative to mass tourism industry. And also as an alternative to not as an alternative, but also as a pathway to eco swaraj. So one of the pathways. Uh, uh, but I want to raise a question here. Don't we need to question? Not don't we need to critique the very idea of this spectacular nature, or what we think as the wilderness that makes nature a spectacular commodity. So so that is one thing, and another question is whose idea of this aesthetic qualities of nature does prevail in this alternative tourism or this so-called ecotourism industry. So can could Ashish respond to this?
You are muted at present, Ashish.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for the important questions. And this is actually a lot of dilemmas and questions that are going through the minds of even a lot of the communities that are doing this kind of homestay based or community led ecotourism. So 2-3 things I'd like to say here. One is that the mainstream model of ecotourism is exactly what you're saying. It is a commodification of nature, of people, of cultures, and so on. That's not the model that these people are doing. So the Mati Sangathan in Munisiari, for instance, when these about 20 women who run homestays there, for them, it's not about trying to exoticize their own culture or the niche, the forests and wildlife around them. In fact, what the visitors are told right from the beginning is that you will be experiencing life as we are living it. And life as we are living it includes, for instance, going into the forest and collecting things. Maybe even not in that case, but in some other cases, maybe even hunting. So that kind of breaks this whole notion of wilderness as something that is set aside, of the exotic, wildlife that will be in these areas separate from people, etc. Also, they make sure that we are not going to give you pizzas and muesli and so on to eat. We will give you what we are cooking. So you have that. I mean, in that sense, one has to also then accept the non-exoticization of local cultures. that you come and take part in our lives. You take part in agricultural operations or whatever it is, right? So there is not an attempt to kind of go out of the way to please tourists with what tourists think they need to see. Um, which is not to say that, of course, they do go out of their way out of hospitality, which is an old Indian custom, right? That if you're a visitor in anybody's house, they will go out of their way to make you comfortable. That, of course, but not what mass tourism expects. And so it's kind of breaking that down. It's also then therefore breaking down the idea of the aesthetics of nature. It's saying that, nature is, again, it's not that pretty picture that you actually are seeing in a calendar. It's there in all of its glories and wonders, but also its threats. If, for instance, there is a bear or a leopard that is, coming into the village, or which is maybe or a tiger that's killing livestock, that's also presented as part of the picture. It's not, erased out of the picture. So you begin to see the rest of nature as not just this wonderful, brilliant, fantastic experience, but also that there are problems with how you actually live within nature. So basically, I'm trying to say that the commodification and the exoticization of nature and cultures, which happens with tourism, including with mainstream ecotourism, is not what this alternative model is about.
Okay, thanks, Ashish. I just have a follow-up question to this. So, can we think of any model of ecotourism, community-owned and community-managed ecotourism, that is not oriented towards monetary-based livelihood?
No. Pradhanma, I think one thing we all need to realize is that virtually every village in the country, except maybe two of the Adivasis in Andaman or the Nicobar Islands, are now linked to the market. We cannot escape that reality. Families who did not earlier need money, they need money. This is not greed. It's actually real needs that they have, right? And so therefore, for them to be able to generate some income, but to generate it in a way that is part of their own dignified livelihoods and part of protecting their own forests and so on, is the solution that they are finding. And I think none of us can responsibly say that you guys should not be entering into any kind of income related activities. That's simply not on. It's the same with the Forest Rights Act, where people are claiming rights to the forest, community forests.
Yes.
They are also earning a livelihood through non-timber forest-based produce. And there are, of course, dilemmas there. There are dilemmas, there are compromises, all kinds of things. But it's not really, the more we can help with building those in more localized exchange systems, the better it will be in terms of delinking from at least the global and national capitalist markets. But to the extent that right now everybody is hooked in, they do need these alternative sources of earning.
Yes, I agree with you, Ashish. But this is where there is the risk of this falling into this trap of neoliberalism, right?
Yeah. But, I mean, that's why we need to go and talk to these movements and understand how they are dealing with it. They're not unaware of it. They are aware of the dilemmas. They do know that. I mean, for instance, if I go to Munsiari and stay in a homestay, I'm traveling all the way from Pune, I'm catching maybe a flight or a train or whatever. There is some level of market and commodification involved. But you cannot go from the current situation to an ideal non-market situation overnight. You need to be able to build processes to do that. And one of the processes is this, but then to say also, how do we localize it? So yes, those traps are there, but these movements, at least the movements I interact with, are aware of those traps. They're discussing them. They're trying to see, okay, how do we avoid those traps in the best possible manner? And how can outside organizations help us to avoid those traps? Yeah, so these are really parts of discussions that are ongoing.
Yeah. Thanks.
Oh, Felix, you were muted.
Uh,
Estella?
yeah, I don't seem to connect. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, sorry about that. Anyway, I would like to, well, obviously, thank you very much for the report. my concern is over the past 2 or 3 years, following events in India from the Indian state, the massive amount of struggles going on in the whole of India, from the farmers to others, have produced a reaction where there are laws, legal laws, which arrest people all over the place, mass demonstration, mass arrests. And I heard from different people how many people find themselves in prison, meaning to say, the situation or the complex situation politically and legally in India, how does this affect, all the movements on the ground and what you're talking about? Uh, so I would be very keen to hear, because I heard from lawyers who are on our network, how they are struggling, to get out people from prisons. And this concerns, women, students, all layers of society. And I have seen some of the laws, which were communicated to me, which were absolutely vile, which sort of surpassed even laws which are, going around from Western governments. So I would like you to comment on that, please.
हेमंत जी, आपको कुछ बोलना है? Because I've been responding to those questions. I also will respond to Estella, पर अगर आपको कुछ बोलना है. हेमंत,
Actually, मेरा data, my data will not long last, I hope.
oh अच्छा, okay.
So, I skip the question.
अच्छा, ठीक है. अगर बीच में कुछ बोलना हो तो बताओ. So Estella, yes, I mean, the situation you're talking about is in fact extremely serious. We have the probably the biggest crackdown on civil society and democratic rights since the political emergency that was imposed by Mrs. Indira Gandhi a few decades back. So it is a very serious situation, and because of that, many of the movements are either silent or quiet for the moment, especially many of the NGOs. But the local sort of on ground struggles of people's movements, of course, continue. They are not going to be scared by this kind of authoritarian tendency of the governments. What is happening though is that civil society groups and individuals who are helping the people's movements on the grounds, many of them are targeted. Some are in jail, some are being threatened with various kinds of consequences. One of our best known environmental lawyers has just been issued a notice yesterday or day before yesterday for supposedly using foreign funds for anti-coal, this thing which is totally false, but then that's how the government is acting. So yeah, it's a very serious situation, and I think in this situation, it's very important for us to continue being in solidarity with each other within India, but also globally. It's very crucial that people's movements across the world understand what's happening here, and we understand what's happening elsewhere, and are able to express solidarity, but very strategically, because sometimes also what happens is that a foreign organization says something in support of a Indian movement, and then that gets used by the government saying, look, you have foreign connections. These are foreign agencies that don't want India to develop, etc., etc. So one has to be a bit strategic and careful, but I think global solidarity in general is very important at this stage for us to be able to get through this phase. The only sign of hope I can say is that Indian civil society has been very strong for a long time. We were able to beat back the political emergency I just mentioned. And I'm confident that we will be able to overcome this current challenge that we face.
Still, I think there is a broader movement building up all around the world, which is concerned about the global war on terror. And if you look at what the US and different states linked to it now are planning to do in terms of militarization of governments, which will stretch to India, meaning that they are already meeting Indian government officials in America to employ military weapons, So there has to be, on top of it, something like an anti-war movement globally, of course, not where people can use it and say, oh, you are linked to terrorists because they're on terrorism lists, But it seems to me we have to overcome these border issues and state issues and really go for a global resistance to these type of laws, and I think they will be essential for survival, regardless of on the ground. And I do think if you look at the Kurdish movement, what they're doing in terms of self-defense, in terms of the war, in the Middle East and through Turkey and so on. I mean, this is going to spread. And there is a necessity of defense. Okay. But I'm putting this in the wider context of a strategy, to defend people in the resistance. And this will be as much important as it is in the UK today, and it will be in India tomorrow in other parts of the world. So this is my point. I think, it's very important to understand the nature of the resistance that's needed globally.
Just in terms of
Yes, absolutely. Sorry,
Just
Jeff,
in-
you were saying.
Yeah, just in terms of the question of the Marxist parties and their position, I think it's important to remind them again and again that in the last decade of Marx's life, he began to fundamentally rethink the question of the transition to capitalism and was looking at the peasant uprisings and communal structures in Russia. And that was that's the mature Marxist position cuts against this more mechanistic Marxist-Leninist caricature of the stages of history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the struggles here, as elsewhere in the world, is the conventional left versus the new left. Unfortunately, the conventional left in India has no imagination left whatsoever. The two mainstream sort of left parties. But there's a lot of leftist new sort of relatively new or breakaway leftist forces which are actually rethinking all of this, including what you just mentioned. And I think this also relates to Malvika's question in the chat, which is about trade unions or other left-wing constituencies aligning with Adivasi and other radical initiatives. So Malvika, yes and no. I think there are certainly some parts of India, such as Kerala, to a much lesser extent West Bengal, where unfortunately in West Bengal, I think the party kind of dominated the left scene much more. In Kerala, there was at least some level of civil society left movements, which were not necessarily uh, dependent on the party. And so you actually find that there are certainly some parts of India where radical, either leftist or Gandhian movements, real Gandhian movements, not the ones that Hemant was talking about, are aligning with Adivasis or with the local radical movements against dams or against mining or for the sort of constructive alternatives that I mentioned. There are also, in terms of trade unions, much more than the big trade unions, the formal big trade unions, most of which are not really coming out there. There are a lot of trade unions now of the informal worker sector, such as waste pickers and so on, which are aligning much more closely to the movements. And then some like the NTUI, the the new trade union initiative India, a few others, or break away from the mainstream trade unions that are definitely aligning much more with the people's movements. So yeah, I mean, that's why I'm saying it's yes and no. But we need much, much more of that than is currently the case, this kind of alignment.
Felix, did you want to say something?
Very, very quickly, just on Estella's point, like Ashish has actually spelt out, India has colonial era anti-terror laws that are incredibly strong. What's called ASPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, especially in Northeast India. We have nobody from Northeast India, where there's many hundreds of tribal movements. And what they face is the ASPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So it's used in many, many ways. So I think the solidarity Estella is asking for is very much needed and huge amount. India can learn from Kurdistan, from Latin America, from many different areas where in some ways the Adivasi movements are quite, there isn't the same linkage because India is so vast. There is solidarity between movements, but it's very hard to create some of the links that are needed. Ashish, would you say anything on that, just to finish up with? Because we have to bring it to an end.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of challenges there. I think size, of course, is one of those challenges. It's a big country. It's a continent in a way. But also the cultural challenges. There's so many languages. We're talking about 800 different languages. And a lot of the local people's movements basically speak their own local language. So then how does one, it's not easy to build bridges of the kind that we need to build. People need to be able to understand each other and understand the nuances of what they're speaking, right? So these are the challenges. The other big challenge, I think, Felix, is that everybody who's involved in movements is overstretched because the government is hitting at us from all angles and they have the resources to hit at us. And of course, now there's a dozen corporations also which are in the play. So we're constantly busy just responding to one challenge after the other. I mean, for instance, the example I just gave you of this environmental lawyer who's just been challenged. Now, this means that we will have to quickly gather up some solidarity to be able to express support for him. Anyway, so there is this constant thing. It's very difficult for any of us to respond if there's a crisis, if there's a fire somewhere in the Northeast or somewhere else. It's not easy to immediately respond. But this is why much more of the National Alliance for People's Movement and that kind of platform needs to become stronger and stronger so that there are this kind of possibility of national and global solidarity. But it is a very challenging time right now. And also, as we know, the media has been completely bought over or silenced. So we just have a few alternative media channels available now for us to be able to get our voice out into the public domain.
Thank you. I had a quick question I wanted to ask about the issue of scale. That was a theme that you mentioned, Ashish, in your talk. I wanted to ask, well, so the way you talked about it was, or outscaling and multiplying were a couple of the dimensions you mentioned around building how movements can connect to each other and grow with one another for a global network. I wanted to ask though, when it comes to the issue envisioning alternative governance and the horizon we hope for when it comes to governing, as the if the programs and aims of the movement were established and implemented, that we're working with the world as it is, and then especially in areas where there's mass industrialized urban metropoles, especially in the quote unquote Western world or first world, in many places all over the world, right? Urbanization, industrialization is happening. And the issue of the scale of modern production, say use of metals, transport, telecommunications, computers, what we're using now. So of course, an alternative, and the program we're talking about requires extensive transformation and restructuring of all our practices and the way we understand things, with the need for rescaling at both the global and local levels as a central issue. But I just wanted to ask if you could say a bit more about your thoughts on the issue of scale in this aspect, in terms of the options for alternative governance in this world that we are living now and are working from.
Thanks, Connor. I'm sorry I dropped off for about maybe half a minute or 45 seconds, so I may have missed a little bit in the middle. But if I understand your question correctly, the issue of scale in terms of governance and then also in the challenges that we face in terms of technology, etc. So please add something in case I missed a part of your question. Yeah, so I think firstly, I think what we need to understand, all of us, is that the most meaningful actions for people are the ones which they can humanly feel. And in that sense, the most meaningful transformations are those that are local, site-specific, place-based, local, where I can see changes taking place in my life, right? Now, from that, how does one build larger structures of transformation or larger processes and relationships of transformation? And I think here, learning from both the Kurdish and the Zapatista or some other movements in central India, for instance, is that we do that through this kind of horizontal building of processes, platforms, networks. On the issue of governance, for instance, one village in central India declared 30 years back that in our village, we are the government. We are the ones who will take all the decisions through our village assembly, right? This has now spread to those other 90 villages, the example of which I gave you. And then all of them coming together to say, okay, we will form a federation of these local autonomous units. And it's that federation over a larger scale that will then, over a larger geographical scale, that will try and achieve things at a much larger level, including confronting the state and making it accountable. So I think we need to think of the possibility of this kind of federating across larger and larger landscapes. And there, the big challenge of saying, okay, what are the representative institutions? We will need representative institutions at that level. And how do those representative institutions remain accountable to the basic units of democracy on the ground, or Swaraj on the ground? So that's where we can learn from some of the examples in different parts of the world of creating this sense of bottom up, ground up governance and democracy, and the accountability of representative institutions through things like constant rotation, reporting back, right to recall, and so on, which is all very different from what liberal democracy is all about. Now, in that, of course, then the role of technology becomes very crucial, because one can think of communities or collectives also now in a virtual sense, right? I don't want to discount those. Those can also be important. Even as the place-based, face-to-face is the most important, we also have virtual communities, which can be important. And so I think our big challenge is, how do we also create and democratize those technological spaces so that we are not dependent on the proprietary softwares and hardwares that the corporations are giving us and are controlling our lives. And we know that there are a number of movements in different parts of the world. For instance, in North America, North and Central America, there's May 1st movement technologies, which is trying to create these sorts of democratic technological spaces, which can then enable this kind of growing geographic and cultural connections across larger landscapes to create grounded governance, but also more larger scale governance. So I think, these are some of the sorts of things. I think there's a lot of experimentation that's going to have to be done on this. And I certainly I don't know if anybody has all the answers, but we can see some trends of the kinds of ground up governance that is possible, and more that could be possible. So Connor, I don't know if I've addressed your entire question. As I said, I missed or
Sure.
address some of it.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. Just as a quick follow-up, I wanted to say, first, on the first point you mentioned around governance and the example of the Adivasi village and then village federation, I was struck by the similarity with the structures that the Kurdish movement endeavors to implement, that they refer to as democratic confederalism, which in turn shares very organic similarities with ways that movements across the world, in Africa and Latin America and different places, operate, just as a deep tradition of communities and peoples and how they organize themselves. So I definitely agree with that. But on that, and coming into the question of technology, just to follow up, or to say, for me, when looking at these issues of course, it's something that has to be experimented with and that we learn as we go and find different things that works in different cases. But you brought up the example of the virtual, the digital. And I think if the virtual, the digital computers is something that we have moving forward, all of the things it takes to produce computers, to run the internet, the satellite network, global telecommunications, everything, and the issue of scale at that level. So I understand in terms of the issue of organizing movements and resistance, challenging state, corporate interest, etc. But then this long, distant, far off possibility of us actually overcoming the global system of state and transnational corporations, what alternatives could look like around this issue of scale in particular when it comes to these big level issues like the virtual internet or telecommunications, transport, railways, production of steel, metals, these kind of things, if you get what I mean. And of course, that's something that's so far off, we can't have all the answers. It has to be as we go. But yeah, my question was just on that angle.
No, I think these are real dilemmas for all of us. And I think the more we're able to actually discuss in dialogue and come up with experiments of what things could look like. So, I mean, could we, for instance, have computer systems which don't need mining in the Congo or somewhere else? Could we have internet systems which don't need the kind of centralized systems that you're talking about? Is that possible at all or not? If it is, then we should try and go for it. If it's not possible, then at some stage we have to actually say as a society that the cost is not worth the benefits.
I'd like to remind you.
How do we get there?
I'd like to remind you of what
Right.
Nkrumah said. Nkrumah said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom." And what I would suggest that the movement's push for is at the governance level, a transformation of the United Nations, but where we have where it behaves as a global House of Commons, and then we could push for democracy at the global level, and that I think is necessary if we're going to stand any chance to transition away from capitalism. So seek ye first the political kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's also, that's also simultaneous local and global transformation, right? So, people have been talking about, can we have a united peoples of the world rather than united nations? Because we're also challenging the nation state itself, right? But what would a united peoples or, I don't know, people's assembly of the world even look like? How would it make sure that it doesn't become another top-down structure of domination? These are all questions that I think we have to go into much more. And learn from the experiences that already exist of larger scale governance mechanisms, which are not top down, such as the Kurdish and the Zapatista. So, yeah. And the United Nations, certainly, I don't know about reforms. I don't know whether it's to be reformed or to be completely replaced with something else, but it certainly is not fit for purpose at the moment.
May I ask, Barry, the name of Abdullah Öcalan did not come up so far.
I mentioned it in my imaginary discussion with Gandhi.
My question is only, we have so many books, okay? And not only the books and the ideas on which, of course, our Peace in Kurdistan is based on. But I only wanted to know, is there any sort of campaign around freedom for Öcalan? Is there anything that is being raised in India on his release after 24 years?
To be very frank, in India, the name Öcalan is hardly known because, as Ashish was saying, there are so many movements.
Okay.
Then more India. I tried to bring it in India. It's quite hard.
Yeah.
But one of the things we're doing now with three of the Kurdish movement of institutions is to bring some of the Kurdish people here. We'll have to do that very carefully for obvious reasons, bring them here, and for some Indians to be visiting Kurdistan over the next 2-3 years. So hopefully we'll be able to build a bit more of at least awareness in India of the Kurdish movement and of Öcalan's imprisonment and things like that. Virtually nobody, including radical movements in India, actually even know about it. And virtually nobody has read Öcalan. I've read one of his books, an
I
exception.
would really like to offer that we would like to raise a campaign to visit, Adivasis and India, and to find people here in the UK or in Europe, especially from parts like Scotland, Wales, etc. I'm sure you know why, okay, or such regions, which would maybe raise the level, of discussion, with the movement here in the UK, meaning to say not just us, but of course the different networks, from the Greens to the alternatives, the resistance movement. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would expect it's a strong suggestion to put and to discuss after our meeting how we can best go about this. Yeah.
Can I just mention on that point? Ashish mentioned the liberal idea of governance, and question from Malvika is highlighting that we take that so much we take for granted, like the UN. It's all framed in a kind of placid multilateralism that is actually part of the problem. It's like we can't see the elephant in the room in a way because we take that liberal framework for granted. You mentioned a bit of that, Ashish, but I think it's very important to really go to the fundamentals, like what is the economy? Like the Kurds, like the Adivasis, trying to control their local economy. And even the economy of then dams and minerals and how much mining do we need and so on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, there's so much fundamental questioning we have to do of things that we're just taking for granted, right? And it's a constant challenge because, even within the civil society sector, a lot of people have simply accepted this. So there's questioning of liberal economy and liberal democracy also. That's what I'd mentioned, right? So, the notion that India is the world's largest democracy simply because everybody has the right to vote is such a superficial notion, right? Or the United States for that matter. So to actually say that we start questioning that, of course, it's difficult to do that, but many of us are saying we are not a democracy if people don't actually have voice. If they're imprisoned or charged with sedition because they dissent from government policy, government is not the nation. Is the sort of thing that is not easy to do. Our courts actually used to, and still to some extent, agree with this argument. In fact, there's a whole bunch of judgments which challenges the state and says that just because there's a state, the government says something doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's national and people have the right to dissent. But that space is also declining rapidly. But one of the things we're doing, Felix, by the way, is through the global tapestry of alternatives. Next year, we're going to be putting together a gathering of communities around the world who are practicing or wanting to practice radical democracy and autonomy to see what are the notions of democracy or different terms that are used by different movements coming up in different parts of the world. What can we learn from each other, and how do we collectively challenge the nation state? And what does that mean in terms of a state itself? Which will also be very interesting in terms of challenging conventional leftist movements and a lot of other things. So we're hoping to do that next year sometime. So physical gathering of these communities, maybe in Chiapas with the Zapatistas.
Thank you. There was a point from Nick.
Yes, if I can turn on. Oh, here we go. I'm just having difficulty turning on my microphone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, a couple of things. One is on solidarity links between Indian movements and Kurdish movements, and that I'm working at the moment with some in northeast Syria, Kurdish part of Rojava, best, on potentially bringing over people from India who are involved in water harvesting, which is a big and live issue now in northeast Syria. And I think that sort of very practical approach to trying to solve particular problems and learning from experiences in India around community management of water and so on will help in establishing the sort of solidarity links that may also increase understanding about the Kurdish movement and vice versa about social movements in India. which may assist in publicizing Öcalan's predicament at the moment. So that's one thing. That's quite. I mean, and I think that will go ahead, and it's quite exciting. Actually, there's a lot of interest in water harvesting in India. And the other thing is just a reflection on this, on Jeff's point about the UN. I mean, the UN definitely needs a lot of reform, no question about that. I'm quite excited about some of the discussions about resurrecting the non-aligned movement and so on. But I mean, I frankly don't see the future in the UN becoming a sort of global House of Commons. I mean, the sort of size of the constituencies would just be absurd. I mean, and we all know from the European Parliament that, the constituencies are so big that most people don't even know who their MP is. When we were part of the European Union, I'm more taken with the idea of the political kingdom being a process rather than an institution. And I've always liked an analogy from the natural world of the slime mold, the amoeba that is a single cell organism at some points, and when it needs to, it comes together as a slime mold, which is acting collaboratively with other amoebas. And I think that is the process that really is the one that is foundational to any real change is going to be the process of solidarity, of coming together around issues with like-minded movements. And that requires a complete shift in the way we think about the politics of organizing, actually, among social movements. I think it's not around the sort of NGOization of everything. It's much more around comradeship and friendship and developing relationships of trust between individuals and mutual learning in order to come around to act as a unity on the issues where we need to act as a unity. And I think that process is really fundamental, which is why I think that exchanges between Indian movements and Kurdish movements are fundamental to building that sort of trust and those sort of relationships of solidarity that are the way forward.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, actually, I was also contacted by somebody suggestions on water harvesting people here, and put people in touch with a couple of groups here. So I'm glad to hear that that's going through. But yeah, I mean, we're also in touch with the CDC, the Center for Civil Diplomacy in northeast, northern eastern Syria, on the possibilities of some exchange programs. We're also meeting them. We actually have a global tapestry of alternatives physical assembly coming up in August in Kenya this year, and 3 of the Kurdish groups are going to be coming for that. So we're quite excited about that.
That's great news.
Yeah. No, so let's see. I mean, we'll have to build this a bit carefully and slowly. I think water is a good way to. It's a sort of relatively non-threatening way of doing it, but we are hoping that over the next 2-3 years there will be much more linkages between the Kurdish and the Indians, and at the very least, much more information and awareness of each other's struggles.
Yeah. Can I just come back a little bit from what Nick was saying? I don't expect very much from any liberal democratic institution. So the proposal to create a House of Commons isn't because I think that the impetus is going to come from above, but to the extent that we need to delegate authority, I think it's important. It behooves us to look at the actual existing structure of the transnational governing institutions. And we need, they're not going to go away just because we wish them away. So we need to, from below, push to make that the locus or the scope of liberal democratic politics.
I think this is a really great topic for a discussion for a separate session altogether. Local to global governance, what could that even look like? And I think that I like the idea Nick has of more fluid structures or non-structures. But what would that look like? I mean, so I think, Felix, I would say maybe you can think of another session on that. It's also getting quite late here. So if it's okay, we could close this session soon.
If I could just throw in one bit, because it relates to the question I had earlier around the jettisoning in many respects of the critique of development. Because one of the things that I noted at the time of in the 80s, when there was a lot of campaigning in India directed at the World Bank, because the World Bank was funding a lot of the development projects that were dispossessing people. Actually, politically, what actually happened was that in order to make the critique to the World Bank politically acceptable in Washington, the entire critique of development got jettisoned. And that is one of the, I mean, it is a real issue about when you try to build these international movements. I agree with you, Jeff. I mean, we have the UN, and there is an absolute fundamental question about probing a reform of the UN. It needs to be done. But we also need to bear in mind that the more you internationalize things, the more things get jettisoned in the process, particularly when you try and build that internationalism into some sort of institutional power. So it's really fraught. I mean, the big debate, as I recall it, and Ashish would be able to correct me, but a big debate in India in the 80s was, do you put your efforts into reforming the World Bank or critiquing the World Bank, if that means jettisoning a whole mass of stuff in order to be acceptable to Republican senators and Republican House of Representatives who have the power to curtail funding for US funding for the World Bank? Or do you put your efforts into critiquing your own national governments and really building power within your own country? I mean, and these things are not easy either or issues. They are, every single time they require an assessment of the political balance, just as, resistance, whether it takes a violent form or non-violent form, needs that same appraisal of the balance of power. I mean, there is absolutely no point in taking up arms when you in an age where if you don't have air power, you're just simply wiped out from the starters. I mean, in those circumstances, non-violent resistance is probably a more powerful weapon. So, these things are always very fraught. But I do think it's a discussion about how one interacts at an international level and builds solidarity at an international level, and movement building and organizing at an international level are real issues for discussion. I mean, they're not being discussed enough. There's an assumption that you can put together paper alliances and that they will be your political institution, and they're not. And we're going backwards the whole time because we're failing to build those sort of international relationships, in my view.
It also gets a bit more complicated because I think the world of the 1980s was a bit simpler than today's world. So now, if you look at it in terms of
Definitely
China and India, and how China and India are also now dominating the weaker countries and trying to create for themselves the same space that the United States and Europe has had, through, for instance, BRICS and BRICS Bank, or through now the G20. India's posturing as a president of G20. So, you begin to actually start seeing a much more complicated world. It's no longer one imperial power versus the rest, or, the Cold War versus everybody else, or whatever. It's now very complex. And so civil society has its work cut out, even first of all, to understand the global politics in these multiple different structures, and then to see where should we put our energies in responding. So in September this year, for instance, right now, civil society in India is discussing, should we do some major action when the G20 is meeting in New Delhi, or should we not? In South Africa, there's discussion going on when the BRICS, now it's BRICS Plus, so they're adding 5 countries are being, another 10 or 12 countries are being added to the BRICS. That's Brazil, South Africa, India, Russia kind of thing. More countries are being added. And they're having their big conference in August in South Africa. And South African civil society groups are wondering what sorts of actions should they take or should they or not. So anyway, so it is a much more complicated world now. And we all have to revise ourselves, our understandings and our strategies according to that.
I totally agree. I mean, I was using the 1980s example simply to, just to refer back to that initial question. But I mean, it is
No, Nick. I think that's really important historical understanding, and I think this is also something we're not doing enough of, Nick. Exactly, just complementing your point, we're not doing enough of understanding that history of the last, say, 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
Where and what did we achieve? Where and what did we not achieve? And how our actions led to some victories and not some victories, and then how is today's situation the same or different or both from that? And in that sense, what of those strategies can continue? Which new strategies do we need? That historical understanding is absolutely crucial. And I don't think we have written or spoken enough of that.